Well, today we have an interesting video, and trust me, we're almost done with the cabbage stuff. I know most of you don't really care, but some people are just about done with the cabbage videos, thinking that we have nothing else to talk about, and I get it. But let me finish up with a few more thoughts that I really feel adds to this mystery in terms of the relationship between orphans and cabbages. This was inspired by a comment actually, so shout out to them. I never really knew about this, but apparently there's this whole lost orphan holiday that was a big part of American history, yet it seems everyone has forgotten about it, or at least it's not really well known. We're talking about ragamuffins, and I found this pretty crazy. So the mainstream story is that ragamuffins are children who dressed up in costumes or really ragged clothes to basically look like orphans and beg. This was known as Ragamuffin Day, and it goes back to when Abraham Lincoln first declared Thanksgiving to be a national holiday in 1863. Interestingly, it originated in Irish and other immigrant neighborhoods in New York, and although the mainstream narrative admits that most of these children were likely working, it tries to make this out as if it was some fun Halloween-like tradition where kids would pretend to be poor in order to beg for gifts door to door after Thanksgiving. But the crazy part about this is that there were thousands of these kids on the street, so many in fact that they would call it a parade. And this is the actual inspiration for the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade. The idea is that these children would dress up, most of them in very worn and torn outfits, and honestly, some of them in these very creepy masks. They would go out into the streets in the thousands and then beg people for nickels or pennies. And if you didn't give them any gifts, they would play practical jokes or really cause complete chaos. The word ragamuffin can refer to a ragged person, and it's even used to describe a demon in the 14th century poem Piers Plowman. But by the 19th century, it had taken on a new meaning in America, describing participants in the tradition of Thanksgiving masking or ragamuffin parades. Over time, people started to question this weird holiday. These kids weren't just parading around, they were starting bonfires, vandalizing properties, and blasting horns. By the late 1920s, it became clear that this was perhaps not such a great idea. Newspaper articles on Ragamuffin Day often noted that the custom was believed to have originated with the foreign-born population of the big city, who, having no Thanksgiving in their own lands, made use of other holidays for carnival masquerades and seized upon Thanksgiving for that purpose after coming to America. So why would so many kids participate in a holiday where they roamed muddy streets in worn clothing, even little children? It starts to make sense when we tie the subject of Ragamuffin Day to the history of the orphan train movement. New York had a significant issue with orphans and street gangs during this time, and these orphans were moved around the United States to repopulate other cities, often for child labor. We're talking about 200,000 children according to mainstream accounts between 1854 and 1929, which, coincidentally, is around when Ragamuffin Day ceased. Interestingly, none of these articles explaining Ragamuffin Day mention the children actually being orphans. This detail's either omitted or not even considered. Why were thousands of children on the streets dressing up as street orphans, wearing these strange masks and begging for money? Where were their parents? What if this wasn't just a holiday, but as a consequence of making Thanksgiving a national holiday, perhaps the day after, all the orphans took to the streets to beg for money, hoping to get enough for food or other necessities. Maybe they were also hoping to be adopted. Think about it. For over 40 years, kids were allowed to cause what was essentially described as riots in the city. This is literally how the newspapers portrayed it. Then suddenly, at the beginning of the 1930s, there's a shift in perspective. Newspapers start saying things like "American boys don't beg," signaling a growing concern for this Ragamuffin Day. It became pretty clear that this tradition might not be such a good idea after all. There were a few more ragamuffin parades into the 1950s, but by then, the event had been transformed. It became more like a conventional parade, resembling Halloween in terms of costume variety. Yet, many of the old photos from the 1920s and earlier don't just show children in costumes. Ragamuffin Day was described as a plague in some accounts. Children would light huge bonfires, and there were even reports of gang fights breaking out with gunfire when two different groups of ragamuffins crossed paths. These weren't just innocent games, they were in street gangs, which in some contexts could be another term for orphans. So this Ragamuffin Day, a day characterized by mischief and pranks, gradually fell out of popularity. It was replaced by Halloween after the 1930s, which is based on this whole idea of going door to door and asking for treats while dressed up. But it's essential to note that the ragamuffins, or orphan children, did it first. Interestingly, the night before Halloween is known as Mischief Night in many different states, yet not too many people know why. This ties back yet again to the Irish with the Celtic roots of Halloween and the ragamuffins. Mischief Night is particularly popular in New Jersey, also referred to as Devil's Night, where children or teenagers engage in pranks and vandalism, very much in the spirit of Ragamuffin Day, which is likely of the same origin. However, Mischief Night has its own unique history, making it even more fascinating. It's a tradition in many states in the US and in England, a day where roles are reversed and children take control. Pretty interesting, but one has to wonder, why would they create a holiday where kids can run around and wreak havoc in the city? The dates for Mischief Night have shifted throughout the centuries, ranging from April to early November, and of the earliest accounts date back to the late 1700s. In her 2012 dissertation at the University of Bristol about the history of Halloween in Northern England, Karen Allen writes that an autobiography of Labour advocate and writer Samuel Bamford, born in 1788, includes a description of Mischief Night. It mentions pranks like pulling up fence posts and tipping over horse carts. The response to these activities, as Bamford describes, indicates that they were likely a tradition, treated with a mixture of mild annoyance and acceptance. It was no big deal, just kids being kids. Even more fascinating is the multitude of variations of this holiday. While it seems to be heavily localized to the northeast of the United States, it also spreads into the surrounding areas. In Michigan, it's known as Devil's Night, which has its own unique history. Remember, these traditions go back several centuries, and their origins are somewhat murky. Why is there a pranking holiday centered around kids causing disruption? Just like Ragamuffin Day, Halloween and Mischief Night weren't initially associated with each other, but they were both most celebrated in areas with significant Scots-Irish immigrant populations. This raises an interesting point. Could there be a connection with the Irish immigrants? Many of the children in the orphan train program were first-generation Irish Catholics. Perhaps it's plausible that this holiday originated from street gangs rather than just children dressing up or gathering to play pranks. What are the implications of such a day still being deeply embedded within our culture of Halloween and Mischief Night, where children go out with friends alone in the streets to beg for candy? Well, it gets even stranger. This day is also known as Cabbage Night. Cabbage Night stems from an old Scottish tradition. In Framingham, Massachusetts, which also calls it Cabbage Night, there's this curious practice. According to Framingham legends, a history of the town, girls on Halloween Eve would pull cabbages from their neighbors' patches to divine the qualities of their future husbands. After the cabbages had served their mystical purpose, apparently the next logical step was to throw them against the doors and run away quickly, thus sparking a long tradition of Halloween pranks. So wait, they were using cabbages as a divination tool, and then they just started throwing cabbages as the next logical conclusion? While the tradition of throwing cabbages is no longer practiced, it's interesting to consider whether it references the orphans themselves. There are artworks depicting cabbages as children on Cabbage Night, complete with faces, and showing them falling in love. Could there be a deeper meaning here? So Halloween was originally Cabbage Night, an Irish tradition, and then Ragamuffin Day was prevalent in Irish neighborhoods. Is there a correlation between cabbages and the orphans who were moved into new cities? Many of these children were working from a very young age. Supposedly, they were all given one day where they could be free and rule the town, causing complete mayhem while dressing up as demons and throwing rotten cabbages. Or were these really just costumes? Or perhaps these were orphans, little rascals gathering in great numbers to cause a significant disruption. Kids just being kids? Kids ruling the city? Why were there so many children begging for money, not candy? It might be easy to dismiss this as mere coincidence, but if the tradition was just about tossing rotten vegetables, then why did it end up with the name Cabbage Night? What does cabbage have to do with foretelling the future and determining who you will marry? Halloween is Cabbage Night. That's not the only connection. The tradition of carving pumpkins stems from the old Irish legend of Drunken Jack, who wandered between heaven and hell with a hollow cabbage lit by a burning coal, simulating a flashlight. It's kind of odd when you think about it because now we carve faces on pumpkins. So wait, pumpkins are cabbage heads? I'm constantly learning new stuff about it, so yeah, that's all for now. Hope you guys have a wonderful Christmas and New Year's. Thanks for watching, and all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.